I'm Luis Scott, managing partner of Bader Scott Injury Lawyers, one of the fastest growing law firms in the country, and I'm also the co-founder of 8-Figure Firm Consulting. I've successfully built multiple companies by focusing on leadership, operations, and culture. Using these principles, my companies have generated close to $100 million in revenue. But before any of this success, I started my legal career as a receptionist, and I worked my way up to becoming managing partner. In each episode of this podcast, I sit down with leaders and entrepreneurs who have had the guts to step out on their own and the courage to face adversity. They share with us their tips for achievement, the challenges they have faced, and the glory of success. I welcome you to the Guts and Glory Show.
Chad Franzen here, one of the hosts of the Guts and Glory Show. We feature top leaders who share challenges of leadership, the guts it takes to succeed, and the of success. This episode is brought to you by 8-Figure Firm Consulting. At 8-Figure Firm, they help law firms to grow to 8 figures. Luis Scott was telling me when he first started his career, he was working over 80 hours a week to make partner. After he finally started his own firm and wished he had someone walking through all this. At 8-Figure Firm, they show you how to develop a business that works for you instead of you working for it. Go to 8figurefirm.com to learn more. Eric Gang, the managing attorney and founder at Gang & Associates. He is an award-winning attorney who represents disabled veterans worldwide. Eric is author of the soon-to-be-released book, Betrayal of Valor by Sutton Hart Press, which is an expose on the flawed VA system and the issues facing disabled. He's been featured on Fox News and other media outlets, and he speaks and lectures widely on veterans topics. Eric, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you today?
No, you're welcome. Thank you. I'm doing well today. Thank you, Chad. Pleasure to be here.
Hey, so tell me a little bit more about Gang & Associates and what you guys do there.
All right. Well, thank you. Gang & Associates is a specialty practice, a boutique practice, as some people call it. We represent disabled veterans in their claims for compensation worldwide. Okay. Unlike a lot of practices that are limited by the geography of their licensure, like a particular state or city, because our practice handles cases at the federal level, we represent people all over the world. Okay. That includes, all the states of the continental United States, plus the territories, and of course, those in the expatriate community living overseas as well. It's a rewarding practice. Having had occasion to practice in some other areas, a little here and there earlier in my career, I have to say that nothing quite beats the personal satisfaction of finally winning the veteran benefits for disabilities that he suffered as a result of his service. It's supremely rewarding, and it's one of the things that keeps me excited about being in law, actually. Very rewarding.
I know you also have a website. I believe it's called Veterans Disability Info. Can you tell me, what people can find out there?
Sure. Yeah. There are, articles about, evergreen topics in veterans benefits law, but also topics of emerging importance that veterans are facing. For instance, we recently posted an article about the jet fuel leak into the water table out at Pearl Harbor that contaminated the water table there and poisoning all the people that were obviously on base, as well as several 100,000 civilians, most likely. So that's going to be an emerging issue for people in the years to come, because as you know, a lot of these toxic exposure situations do not cause medical problems right away. There's certainly a lag time between exposure and the onset of disease. We also talk a lot about Camp Lejeune and the effects of the contaminated water at that base from the mid-50s through the mid-80s. Everybody that passed through there was exposed to the contaminated water there. So we also have a lot of examples of case studies where we've helped veterans win their cases. Keep in mind, people don't come to us unless they've got a difficult case, unless they've been denied multiple times on their own. Okay, so we don't see the easy cases like a shrapnel wound. People are saying to themselves, where'd you get the shrapnel wound? It's pretty obvious. We're dealing with chronic diseases that do not manifest right away, and hence the difficulty in getting them service connected. And that's why they need, a law firm like ours. We're certainly not the only people in this space out there, but we do believe we offer real value for our clients in helping them win these very difficult cases. So we thrive on the difficult cases, the really complicated medical ones. Are the cases that we really enjoy handling. So there's just some resources out there that help veterans understand the topics that are, facing them, as well as a lot of good examples of people who have gone down this road and have won their cases. I often, receive phone calls from clients that express a lot of frustration and discouragement over how long it takes. These are guys that are fighting the system sometimes for 10, 15 years or more, and they don't see light at the end of the tunnel. I do, because I've been down this road with lots and lots of clients over the years, and I know from experience there's light at the end of the tunnel. But from their perspective, their only perspective is their own case. They wake up every day wondering when the VA is going to grant their claim. Every time they don't have money to eat or to pay for shelter, they're reminded of how long this case is taking to win. And it's frustrating for them. That, on the other hand, makes it so much more rewarding when we do finally win their cases. It's that thrill of victory. And, it's, years ago, if you remember, the ABC Worldwide World of Sports used to have an intro of a ski jumper crashing at the end of the ski jump. And they always talked about the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, And fortunately, we don't experience a lot of agony of defeat in our practice, but certainly the thrill of victory is an ever-present motivator for us. And sometimes I say to these clients, I say, look, I've been down this road with other clients before. I've taken them safely to the other side. Sometimes I'll quote Psalms 23, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. So I say, look, I've taken people through the valley of the shadow of death and led them safely to the other side. There is hope, and we can help you. And we get there, but it takes years. I have clients on my docket that have been my clients on active appeal for 10, 15 years, same case. So that's why when you finally win, it's just phenomenal. It really is, So
why are you so passionate about? Sure. Why are you so passionate about representing veterans?
I recognize that they do something that a vast majority of our population does not do. Okay. The percentage of people that have served this country represents a very small percentage of our overall population. It's not like some European countries where there's a certain amount of mandatory military service that every young man has to do when he gets to be a certain age. We have an all-volunteer army. And because of that, oftentimes, the military does recruit from ranks of people that don't otherwise have opportunities to pursue higher education. So they join the military as a way of getting their education funded. And they bear a disproportionate burden for our society. They deserve our help. And they're doing something that oftentimes, frankly, to be honest with you, they're doing things that sometimes individuals coming from wealthier classes are not doing. If you look at the data, the wealthiest families in our country have the smallest percentage of children being sent into the military. Conversely, the lower tier economic groups in our country send the most individuals into the military. So it's about, to some degree, it's about equity. It's about fairness. It's about social justice in some way as well. And, you see the class divide sometimes, and a higher percentage of our veterans are represented in the homeless population. The veterans' suicide rates are higher than those that have not served, okay, as a percentage. So as a rate, okay. So there are a group of people that need our help. They need to know that our society stands behind them. And it's popular to support veterans' causes. But sometimes I don't know if people really understand sometimes how difficult their lives can be when they come back from service with injuries or illnesses from their service, and how hard it is to reintegrate into society, especially if you're suffering from some of the psychiatric residuals of service. It makes it extremely difficult. I spoke a couple of years ago. Princeton University had a conference on diversity, right? So they invited me to speak, and the topic was, to what extent does a university try to hire veterans in order to speak to that issue of diversity, because we hear about diversity all the time in the hiring place. We certainly talk about hiring minorities and other groups to try to make our workforce more diverse, but we don't typically talk about veterans because if you think about it, they are an extreme minority in our society, okay, in terms of a percentage of people that have actually served. But the challenges are a bit different because if you come back, if you're a disabled person, let's just say you're in a wheelchair, it's easy enough to build a ramp to access the place of employment or to have an elevator. But if somebody's suffering from severe PTSD with anger issues and lack of judgment, and they're having hallucinations, it's very hard to accommodate that in the workforce, no matter what type of job. Okay, so it presents some real challenges, and our veterans do need our focus, our sympathy, our help, our support. And the general public needs an awareness of the issues they're facing. And they have a lot of health problems too. Many years after service, I deal with it. I'm looking at their medical records for 30, 40, 50 years. It's a life of challenge that they face. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate. There's many, but that's one of the main ones. I am a bit of
That's a good one.
Social justice person, and I'm concerned about, people that are not being treated equitably in our society, and they're a group that fits that bill. And again, veterans come from all walks of life too. In my practice, I've represented Native Americans from the reservations out west to a large practice in Puerto Rico, to just about all different ethnic groups. So it is a cross section of society from that perspective. But as a group, they represent a tiny minority. 22, 23 million vets in the United States out of a population of what, 300 million, something like that. It's a very small percentage. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about it.
Yeah, I mentioned that you're the author of a book soon to be released called Betrayal of Valor, which is an expose on the flawed VA system and the issues facing disabled veterans. What are some ways in which the VA system is flawed?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's, in the book, I talk about a number of different topics. Okay. The overarching theme is that veterans are falling through the cracks and they're being left behind, so to speak. Okay. We talk a lot about the issues of post-traumatic stress disorder and all the problems that causes. We talk about military sexual trauma, okay, how that is a very widespread problem in the military and how difficult it is to prove those cases. Particularly the male-on-male sexual assaults are extremely difficult to prove because those victims are the most unlikely to ever report it, okay? And we talk about the crisis with VA healthcare and medical malpractice in the system, in the healthcare system. We talk about the suicide problems. We talk about the health problems in general and the lack of good preventative medicine and, the type of medicine that's actually going to help them get better rather than continue to nurse them along, treating their symptoms, actually helping them get better. We touch on the issues of the appeal system and how the system tends to churn cases for years and years and years before they can finally get relief. Dealing with the VA administrative appeal system is a very soul-crushing experience. That's the term I remember one author using to discuss just how frustrating the process can be. I had a case one time, this is absolute truth. The case was on appeal nonstop for 54 years. Okay. He filed in the mid 60s and it took us 54 years to get the claim granted. Okay. I had another case that I won maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, 44 years on appeal. And I've had many that have been, 15, 16, 17 years on appeal. Funny story. I had a veteran, Navy veteran who participated or he observed, I should say, the atomic testing in the South Pacific, Micronesia, the Marshall Islands. And he was standing on the deck of a Navy vessel and watching the mushroom cloud go up. And he talks of, experiencing radioactive fallout and so forth. He developed some health problems later on. he filed his claim when he was in his mid-50s. And I finally helped him get his claim granted by the time he was in his mid-80s. And this is the funny part. He says, thanked me. And he says, finally, I will have some money to help my 4-year-old daughter go through college. So, so he had some poor health problems, but he still had a child at the age of 81. So it was good for him. But that's not, it's not, I wouldn't say those are the majority of cases, but it's certainly not uncommon for every attorney that does what I do to have a handful of cases that have been on appeal for decades.
Would you say the flaw in the system are easily fixed or have clear solutions, and they're just not being dealt with?
They recently tried to make some changes. In 2019, they began applying a new rule or new law that was enacted a few years ago, the Veterans Appeals Improvement Modernization Act. We call it AMA, or Appeals Modernization Act. It was a system that was designed to, try to make things more streamlined. It changed the way we did things, since before World War II, practically. And the jury's still out on whether that's really going to change a whole lot. I think the difficulties that the system faces are institutional. It's hard to change the institutional culture of an organization as large as the VA. It's the second largest cabinet agency after the Department of Defense. It has its own culture. It has its own way of doing things that's just ingrained in the culture of the organization. It's bigger than one person. The secretary of the VA, whoever that might be, depending on who's president, has the ability to hire and fire maybe a few top people. Okay, but to change the institutional culture of a huge, bureaucracy like VA is next to impossible. And I think, big bureaucracies on their own they take actions to preserve themselves. Okay. And it's not something any one person is doing. It's not a mandate coming down from the top. It's not probably even spoken of. It's just like one of those things that's just part of the culture. And, they're going to scrutinize every claim because there's the fear that somebody's faking it and trying to get away with getting money for nothing. And there's just also a lack of understanding of the circumstances. A big issue is a young veteran will serve, get out of service in his early 20s. He may feel some minor aches and pains. He is not going to say anything because he wants to go home. He doesn't want to be held over for medical reasons. Well, he goes along with his life. He's young enough. He still has some strength of youth in him that allows him to power through. And as he gets older, those problems become more significant. Then the effects of age combine with the advancing progression of degenerative health problems. He finally makes a claim, but he's got 25 years of no medical complaints. He was experiencing them, but he never went to the doctor. Okay, so that creates a huge challenge. The VA sees this and says, there was nothing wrong with him. All of his problems came as a result of something that happened decades later as a civilian. It also happens in the service where the culture is certainly a culture of machismo. You're not going to complain. You're not going to be considered a malingerer or a complainer. And so if you do suffer an injury or have a problem, you're very unlikely to go complain about it. It's very particularly the case if it's a mental disability. You're not going to go complain about, not being able to handle the stress or something like that. So, they start to develop these symptoms in service, but they don't say anything. The VA turns around 20 years later and says, your service medical records are negative for any complaints regarding this condition. Therefore, it didn't happen during service. But that's naive. It's, it demonstrates a lack of understanding of reality. Okay. The dynamics in the military that militate against people coming forward to complain. So those are just some dynamics that are at play.
Sure. When did you, what originally attracted you to becoming an attorney, and when did you kind of know that was what you wanted to do?
Well, this is an interesting story. I don't know if you want to hear this on the podcast, but I'll do my best.
Oh, most definitely.
Story. It's a good story. um, I When I was a teenager, I got into a little bit of trouble with the law, so to speak. Nothing. Put it this way: I had a penchant for practical jokes, and one time a practical joke got kind of out of hand, and the authorities were called, and all of a sudden, I was being threatened with lengthy prison term. So I hired a lawyer. My parents hired a lawyer. It happened to be the father of a friend of mine. He wasn't even a criminal lawyer. He was a corporate lawyer. It was kind of like that motion picture, My Cousin Vinny, where we don't know a lawyer. Let's just hire my cousin, it was that kind of deal. So, and I was in high school at the time, and the lawyer came in and he made everything go away. Okay. Everything was dismissed. It worked out fantastically. But at that moment, as a 17, 18-year-old kid, whatever I was, you don't really have a good perspective on things. And I really thought I was going to prison. I thought my life was over, And I really started to see that the law, practiced by people of moral integrity, is a noble profession that can really make a difference in people's lives. And it was that spark that changed everything for me. And I was never a bad kid. I never was intentionally getting in trouble with the law. I just was poor judgment as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
But I'm leaving some details out, of course, but the bottom line is that my involvement in firsthand of seeing a lawyer change my life was a watershed moment for me and really motivated me to go to law school. And it also helped to determine my practice as well, because, throughout all my years in practice now, I think I'm 24 years in practice now, I've always represented people with problems, real people with problems. I've, aside from maybe once I represented a doctor in the sale of a medical practice once, but aside from that, I've always represented individuals with real problems that needed help. And the lawyer was kind of like the life preserver for them. And so, granted, we've all heard high profile stories of rotten lawyers gone bad and losing their law licenses for different things. But that's why I always preface it to say that, there are, in a free society, one of the reasons why we are free is we have lawyers that are regulated by state bars and so forth that practice this profession. And oftentimes we are that last stop between the population and tyranny, Granted, it's more the case, I think, if you're a criminal lawyer or things like that. But, think about, I'm sure you may have interviewed many personal injury lawyers in this podcast before, but think about, the safety of products being what they are, because lawyers were the ones to bring lawsuits. If there was no threat of that, would big corporations and big, entities take the safety precautions that they do? Probably not. Okay. So lawyers serve as a bulwark against, either out of control corporations or an out of control government. So that's kind of my take on it.
Sure. What's a favorite story? You said you've been practicing now for 24 years. What's maybe a favorite story from your practice?
Oh, yeah. Well, all right, I'll tell you a couple funny stories. I represent veterans, of course, and I'll tell you a few veteran stories, and I'll tell you some stories from my early practice. I had a veteran once who he got into a lot of fights during service and had a lot of head injuries. He was a big guy, and he had his penchant for getting in fights wherever he went, with the police, everybody. He had post-traumatic stress disorder, and it wasn't working. But when I found out how much money he was making, I questioned, what was he doing to earn this money? He was a professional panhandler. Okay. He actually made a six-figure income, essentially begging. And he had a laptop and he kept a spreadsheet. He knew which corners to go to. He had it all mapped out. And he was making a tremendous living, um, sitting on the sidewalk with a well, I don't know, whatever, he had a tin can to collect donations in or whatever. He says, yeah, on a good day, $700-800 a day, he says. So I thought that was really interesting. But I'll tell you one of the stories that I think was most meaningful to me in this practice. I represented a young, well, he wasn't young anymore by the time he came to me. It was a veteran who has never been able to work. He was from Brooklyn, New York. Before the service, he was found wandering the streets of Brooklyn while talking to himself, and he was picked up and taken to the psychiatric ward at Kings County Hospital and diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, it's very rare for us to have pre-service medical records in the file, but this particular case had pre-service medical records in the file. So he tried to serve in the military and went in during Jimmy Carter's administration. And he was denied benefits on the grounds that his schizophrenia was pre-existing, which all evidence suggested that it may have been. Okay. So, obviously he got discharged early. And since the time he was probably 19 or 20, he's never been able to work. So that was in 1977. Okay. So he came to us maybe a dozen years ago after another law firm had rejected him and told him his case wasn't winnable. I even had one of my psychiatric experts take a look at it who expressed grave concerns about the viability of the case. And I didn't know what to do. This guy really needed, he was living on a couple $100 a month in SSI, income. So I discovered a notation in the file that he had experimented with LSD as a teenager. I was able to successfully argue that what was diagnosed as schizophrenia before service was actually just a LSD hallucination. Anyway, long story short, we got a grant of benefits for him after 44 years. And he was awarded over $900,000 in back pay. Okay. And I called him up to share the story with him. And I said, and this is the honest truth, that argument I came up with was nothing more than a, Hail Mary at the end of a football game. Okay. And I knew, I felt bad for him. I said, let me try, even though other law firms had rejected him for good reason. Okay. They didn't think the case was winnable. Neither did I, And I called him up and I said, this is a miracle that you won this case. You understand that, right? I said, no, this is legitimately, this is just an amazing result in a situation that you should not have been granted these benefits. So he says to me, he says, Mr. Gang, he says, I've been praying every single day for 44 years, he said. And finally, God has answered my prayer. And he was able to buy an apartment. He then got married and it changed his life. Okay. But had we been like everybody else and just given up on him, who knows where he'd be right
Sure.
now, same place. It's one of those things that keeps us going in this practice. And I've had others as well. Another example, he represented a young man from North Carolina who volunteered to go to Vietnam right after he turned 18. He got there and he could not handle the combat. Okay, there was rockets going off everywhere. He just couldn't handle it, so he turned to heroin to try to cope, and he got caught with the heroin. He was discharged from the service under other than honorable conditions, which means you're barred from VA benefits. And he came home, had a lot of problems. He ended up killing his brother and was not able to kind of live independently, lived with his mother. And he ended up having another homicide later on during the appeal period, actually. We represented him for, I think it was about 17 years. And we were able to argue that the drug use in service was his way of self-medicating from the stress of the early onset of PTSD. And it took us a long time. We fought the case a couple times at the U.S. Court of Appeals, multiple experts. And finally, we got the VA to rule that his, character of discharge should not bar his benefits. He should get VA benefits notwithstanding, which we finally did after many, many years in service. And I remember speaking to his mother. His mother this is one of those situations. The mother was only about 15 years older than he was. And she always talked to me on the phone. He was in his 60s. She was probably 80. And she was grateful because she felt that after all these years that maybe her son could finally live independently and have enough money to have his own place and live by himself after 66 years of living with his mother. So it was just a rewarding experience the other thing about him was he was a Project 100,000 veteran, which was the McNamara idea in the late 60s to get more men from Vietnam. The idea here is that they needed more men, but the idea of drafting college men would have been politically unpopular. So what they did was they lowered the standards of admission into the military to pick up people that do not meet the physical or mental standards. Okay, so again, I want to be sensitive, and I'll only use the parlance that was used at the time was retarded. Okay, I know we might have a more progressive term for that now, but in the parlance of the day, that's what these people referred to. They were often mistreated in the service. A lot of bad things, happened to them. They were typically put on the front lines. They typically suffer higher rates of casualties than others. And this particular client was in that category. So it was, doubly rewarding for us to finally help him to win that claim, given what he had been through and the tragedies of his life that he'd experienced. His brother and his other brother, the surviving brother, and his mother would tell me just how he came back from Vietnam, just not the same person, just how it destroyed him. And so at the end of his life, we were able to finally get him something. And I think the thing that makes a big difference in these cases, Chad, is that these guys feel like the best years of their life were taken. Okay. And then when the VA comes back and continues to deny them, they feel like their service didn't matter. Like they gave up their youth, their strength, their life. And VA doesn't want to recognize it and grant the claim. So when we finally win these claims, it is in a way a statement that their service mattered,
Mm-hmm.
That's meaningful. And that's, again, kind of someone feel like their manhood's been taken from them, and we do our best to give that back to them and give them a sense of vindication.
Sure. Hey, I'd love to talk about some lessons learned in your practice journey.
Sure.
But first, how did you discover eight-figure firm and Louis Scott?
Oh, I think I met Luis at a conference in Utah, and he spoke, and I came up to him afterward to discuss practice issues with him. It was a conference that had a lot of business-oriented lawyers and people that were really on the business side of law. And he was one of the featured speakers. And I met him afterwards, and we spoke, and he gave me his card, and we connected later on. And so, the business side of the practice of law has always been a big interest of mine. And, being able to connect with Luis has really just given me a lot of great ideas and has really affirmed a lot of things that I've been studying. And but some of his insights are profound.
What are some of the insights he shared with you, or some lessons you've learned from him?
Well, yeah, let me give you an example. He kind of alludes to this concept about thinking, like a lawyer in terms of your case selection versus thinking about, building a business that has residual capacity to continue to produce income. For instance, we were having a conversation the other day where he was talking about this idea of conversion rate, okay, for clients. And I said, no, we only accept a very tiny percentage of people that, come to us, right? And he says, look, we accept everybody. And I said, why? And he says, because accepting everybody widens your footprint in the community. Every person you represent is a person that can go through your client journey and experience the good service. That person then in turn, I'm not quoting him, I'm kind of giving you the gist of what he was saying, in turn becomes an ambassador for your firm to send you referrals that don't cost anything. And that over time will drive down your cost of acquisition, okay, for the business. So the concept of not running this very low volume practice, some guys have a really low volume practice with, high ticket cases, but that is a very small group of people that you're having interactions with. So it was a little bit of a paradigm, shift in thinking that he was presenting. And that is to think about, your idea of being able to spread out your influence in the community through a larger army of happy clients versus, a handful of clients means only a handful of additional contacts that could potentially bring inbound referrals to your business. So that was quite an interesting concept that cut against the notion of, trying to have fewer cases where you charge more money. Therefore, the thinking would be higher profit margins. So it was an interesting concept. But the other concept that he really emphasizes is the leadership moments and the opportunities where, you're directing, you're developing, you're supporting your key people, and they in turn are teaching that to their people under them. And, it's about shifting your focus from, working in your practice to working on your practice. And his focus is really the idea to grow is really moving into that role of leader and to be the primary person who's, speaking to the values of the organization and then teaching that down the line to the people underneath you. And that's, I'll tell you this just from a practical standpoint. These ideas and concepts are out there in the business press, okay, and so forth. But he teaches it in a way that gives you just the material you need to know. And he kind of breaks it down and simplifies it and condenses everything that's out there into what you need to know to make your practice work, okay? That's kind of an important thing because there's a lot of books out there and all of them have great ideas. But to be able to distill down just what you need into bite-sized pieces that can be implemented in a very short time span that are applicable to law firms, that's invaluable.
Sure. That's great advice. Very good to hear. I have one more question for you, but first, how can people find out about Veterans Disability Info and more about Gang and Associates?
Sure. Well, www.veteransdisabilityinfo.com is our website where you can go. And I think you can find out information on my upcoming book at suttonhartpress.com, I believe, the publisher's website. But those are the websites you can go to find out about the book, find out about our firm and what we do to help veterans.
One more question for you. You've shared some great stories already, but do you have one? This is the Guts and Glory show. So we like to focus or tell a story that, really took a lot of guts and kind of resulted in some glory for you. Do you have like a story that you can think back on where it's like, it was probably against all odds,
Sure.
but I did it and it took a lot of guts.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty easy to answer. I was one of those guys that got out of law school and I started working at a firm in New York City. I hated it. I may have been there maybe 9 months. I said, this isn't for me. So I, at the time, was married at the time. I think my wife then was pregnant with my first child, and I think she had stopped working. And so there was no second income in the family. I had no money, zero money, no source of income because I didn't have a working spouse. And I decided I'm going to start my own firm. So I opened up my own shop with no money, no clients, and no source of income. And it was crazy. And I certainly wouldn't recommend it to anybody. I think Jay Foonberg's book on how to start and build a law practice, published by ABA, was a big motivator in my doing it. His theory was, you're used to living the student lifestyle, not having any money. Why not start the practice now? Sounds like great advice. So that's what I did. So I was able to start the practice by convincing a banker to lend me some money. And then I got a bunch of credit cards and maxed them out and started this practice on borrowed money and credit cards. And I would go into the office every day and, hope for the phone to ring. And I ended up taking everything that came in the door, everything from criminal cases to bankruptcy cases, real estate closings, everything. And I got my first big break with a personal injury case that I settled pre-suit for like $300,000. Now, this was like 20 some years ago, 23, 24 years ago. It was a lot of money back then. And I said, this is great. That carried me for a whole year, with a little bit of overhead on the practice. And that kind of got me going. And I look back on that now, and I can see how foolish that was from many perspectives. But I say that you learn something in that experience. You learn something from those experiences that people that don't make that move just can't understand. Okay, there was a certain degree of youthful confidence that I had back then. That was in part because of my own ignorance. But I think starting a practice months out of law school with no money, no income, no sources, no plan for even how you're going to get clients was crazy. Under most circumstances, most people would have given it a little bit of a shot for a year or two and then figured, I can't do this, and I'd go work for somebody. I never did that, really. I just kept going in different formats through over the years and battled my way to where I am now. We have a multi-million-dollar law practice that started with nothing. It really started with nothing. And I shared office space with other lawyers. I did per diem covered depositions for them to get a little bit of cash. Did just about everything that I possibly could. And little by little, took a long time, but we finally got to where we are today. So it does take a bit of guts to do that, and mixed with a little bit of foolishness, I have to say. But it's really the persistence, I think, that paid off. Indefatigable persistence.
Yeah,
got us to where we are today.
That's an amazing story. Congratulations on sticking through it and on all your success. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing for veterans. And also, I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
No problem, thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.
You too. So long, everybody.
You've been listening to the Guts and Glory Show with Louise Scott. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to share. For more information on this episode, please see the show notes at www.gutsandgloryshow.com. And join us next time as we talk to another leader in business that had the guts to overcome all odds for the glory of success.